Today's conveyancing clients expect speed, clarity, and frequent updates. But tight margins and rising client expectations put pressure on conveyancing practices. With smart automation and clear workflows, Leap helps conveyancing teams spend less time on admin and more time supporting their clients. Learn more at leap.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today we are talking about stamp duty and the requirement for conveyancers to register as tax advisors. The deadline for registration is imminent, and I'm delighted to say I've got two experts on the subject on the podcast with me today. Ian Quayle, CEO of IQ Legal Training, and Ryan Hanna, Managing Director of Compass. I'm going to give you both the opportunity to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, but this is a pressing issue for conveyancers. Today's Conveyancer have recently run a bit of a straw poll on social media around how firms feel about the requirements, how prepared they feel, and it's blindingly obvious that firms feel very unprepared, and that the guidance that has so far been produced is, I think, probably fair to say, reasonably unhelpful. So hopefully with the help of my two guests, we can unpick some of that. Ian, you've been on the podcast before, but if you wouldn't mind very quickly giving us a bit of an overview of yourself and your role, please.
Happy to do that, David. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along today. Yes, my name is Ian Quayle. I work with IQ Legal Training. I am the chief executive, whatever that means, and I spend my life going up and down the countryside, boring people to death, talking about things such as land registration, avoiding negligence claims, best practice in residential conveyancing sector, commercial property work, etc. So as far as SDLT is concerned, I do a bit of training with regard to SDLT, trying to help residential conveyancers with what they need to know. I also look at what is best practice, and I'm very interested in how residential conveyancers can avoid negligence claims and client complaints. The point, David, that I think would be my starting point today is that I always work on the principle that residential conveyancers are, in essence, general practitioners. And therefore, unless they hold themselves out as experts in a particular field, all they're required to do is to give basic advice and to identify risk and issues. So with regard to the SDLT issue that we're addressing today with Ryan, my starting point is that as a residential conveyancer, you're required to have some knowledge of SDLT. You are required to be able to submit an SDLT return and to pay the appropriate SDLT as and when it falls due. I'll be very, very reluctant to recommend to residential conveyancers that they describe themselves as tax experts or tax advisors. And therefore, I come at this from a position of horror, in that I worry that if you are a generalist, which I think what residential conveyancers are, that there is an inherent danger in suggesting to a client that you are an expert or a specialist in a particular field. And therefore, if you do register yourself as a tax advisor to the lay client, there's a risk that the lay client then thinks, well, you are a specialist in connection with SDLT on the basis that you're a tax advisor. I also worry that the lay client also thinks, well, if you're a tax advisor, you should also be telling me about capital gains tax. You should be telling me about sort of what I would class as peripheral taxes associated with the conveyancing process. So I'm unhappy with this from a training perspective. I'm also unhappy with this because my trials and visits up and down the countryside, everyone I talk to is concerned about this. And I'm really interested and delighted that we've got Ryan along today from Compass, because my view is that Compass provides a solution to what I see as a really difficult issue. But David, that's enough of me. But hopefully that puts my position and explains a little bit about what I do as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, if there's an endorsement there, then I don't know whether there's a better one, Ryan. But you've you've got a solution, but I mean, look, this isn't a sales pitch. The point here is to really try and understand what the opportunity is for conveyancers. In the first instance, though, in the same vein, perhaps you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about yourself as well, and how you've got to where you are.
Yeah, my name is Ryan Hanna. I fortunately spent most of my youth growing up with a father who was, say, involved in this tax. It's no real state secret that he was involved in some of the dark side of this stuff. My form of teenage rebellion was actually going, I don't like this. I want to go in the other direction. So I founded a company, and I know this is a podcast about conveyancers, but got to be honest, my soapbox is always from the taxpayer's perspective more than the conveyancers. And that's where I came from. So yes, I have a product and I have a solution that does technically solve the risk element of SDLT calculations. But my belief in all of this is that every taxpayer in the country exists under the same piece of law. We should all have it applied to us equally, regardless of financial privilege and circumstance. Solving that is obviously a slightly more complex question, but yeah, that's me.
So to get into the nitty-gritty of what this registration is in the first instance, I mean, Ryan, have you got a bit of a handle on what HMRC are trying to achieve or seem to be trying to achieve with this registration?
Yeah, I mean, I thought I did, and then they decided to double down on this payment point. So I thought it was quite clear that, and I have been saying that this isn't for me a change. This for me is a confirmation of the state of affairs that's always existed between a client and a conveyancer. Now, I take Ian's point completely that, and I agree, the more we actually get conveyancers to register as tax advisors, the higher the risk is that a purchaser is going to think there's a higher competency there or a higher level of capability than there actually should be. And again, that's a separate conversation about whether there should be or not. But I actually make the argument that that expectation has always existed, and this is where we have the problem. You have a purchaser coming through to a conveyancer who should be doing conveyancing, and yet you have this little dark area of tax advice, and it is tax advice because you are making decisions that ultimately end up in a client paying tax. There's been lots of conversation about disclaimers at the end of client engagement and blah, blah, blah. But look, really the brass tacks is if you are, and conveyancers were, handing out a document and a questionnaire, having a client filling it in and they're saying, this is how much tax you need to pay, it's tax advice, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment.
And Ian, we have some guidance now, don't we? Although we're waiting for sector-specific guidance. But what I mean at the moment, what does that guidance effectively tell us?
Let's take a step back, David, and have a look at what a conveyancer should do, right? So I'm looking at this from the professional obligation of a conveyancer or solicitor. They are required to undertake work and provide advice as any reasonably competent solicitor or conveyancer would do, and that would involve them in identifying the potential for SDLT liability, looking at the relevant reliefs and surcharges that are applicable to the client's circumstances, applying those reliefs and surcharges, calculating SDLT, formulating the return, submitting the return, and paying the tax as required. So that's from, if we're looking at it purely and simply from a solicitor or conveyancer's perspective, that's what they're required to do. As far as the requirement for registration is concerned, that doesn't have any bearing whatsoever on the professional obligations that the lawyer owes to the client, but it does have implications and obligations with regard to compliance issues and the HMRC and solicitor-lawyer relationship. And I mean, as far as that's concerned, it's clear cut. If HMRC say you've got to register, then you've got to register. Simple as that. Now, again, Ryan will probably be in a better position than me, but at the moment, I'm getting all sorts of mixed messages from Law Society and other professional bodies and from HMRC themselves. And I've got a sort of spectrum of positions to think about. At one end of the spectrum, every fee earner that undertakes conveyancing work is required to register. And if you submit a return, if you're providing advice, or if you simply pay SDLT, you're giving tax advice. So that's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is a situation where the lawyer is doing all of those things and again is giving advice. And I would agree with Ryan, no matter what you think and no matter what you do, if you're complying with your professional obligations to the client, you are giving tax advice. So there's no doubt. So I've got this sort of binary position of registration or not registering as an individual. Okay. I've then got the situation where, and I've had messages to this effect, perhaps only one partner in a firm has to register as a tax advisor, and everyone else can work within that umbrella. And again, I'm not so sure about that. And I'm not so sure about, is it the head of department? Is it a sort of specialist that deals with that registration? I'm not sure about that. Again, I get various messages from whoever I talk to. So to be very unhelpful, David, I currently couldn't tell you what you're required to do. But I look at it and think, worst case scenario, any fee earner who's undertaking conveyancing work must register. Best case scenario, perhaps one person within the firm has to register. I don't see how HMRC is going to back off and say this is a bad idea, just forget it. I think that what we've got at the moment is confusion. Every day I wake up and think we're going to get some clarity. I ain't seen it yet. I don't know whether you have, Ryan, but my view is that we're stuck. Meantime, the day is looming larger for the profession, and we don't have clarity.
Yeah, I mean, on the back of that, I have heard through the grapevine, I can't state the source, but the next big meeting with HMRC is around the 4th, 5th of June, I believe I've been told, which is obviously post the registration open date. So there's going to be naturally an increasing level of anxiety around what you need to do, especially if we get past that open date without clarity, and especially if we don't get clarity on this payment point. The conversation I keep having, though, is trying to split this into two parts, because the part of register or not is one thing, and then, as David asked earlier, the question of why HMRC are even doing this in the first place is another. And then actually there's a third conversation of what parts do we need to pay attention to, and what is the net effect? I mean, as it stands, every conveyancer in the country is going to have to register. That's as it stands. And as they stated in the latest meeting, they regard payment as communication under Lim D, I believe it is, of the guidance. So, I mean, on that, we're just basically dead. Like, that will force a registration. But let's assume you do have to register. Just because you've done a administrative task of registration and you have identified your key personnel, does that automatically mean that we should be doing tax advice? And that's kind of where the blurred lines are for me right now. And it seems to be all or nothing. When there was the conversation around whether services like mine meant you didn't have to register, immediately everyone was going, oh yeah, great, we'll outsource everything and you do everything, we do all the returns, cool, we don't need to register. But then as soon as it's having to do the administrative task, it's when we're now going to go back to doing all of the tax advice. I don't really understand why those things seem to be intrinsically linked.
But here's the conundrum, because, I mean, to the tax advice point, there are sort of stages of tax advice, if that's the best way to describe it, because, and this is part of the sales pitch for a number of these outsourced service providers, is there's a reasonably sort of basic SDLT submission that you might make, your 2 up, 2 down, town centre dwelling, and then there is your sort of mixed use field, paddock, whatever it might be. I see you raising your eyebrows, Ryan, because you're going to come back to me on that one, I know. But there are, this is a grey area already, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, that's literally why I invented my process versus a lot of these other ones that use screening systems, because whether I'm right or wrong remains to be seen, but I fully and wholly believe that if you've made the decision not to look into something because you are looking at a property and making a tax determination, i.e. it's a simple 2 up, 2 down, as you said, you've just made a tax determination before looking into all the facts. You've gone to the conclusion in order to justify doing the process. So that's the whole thing I've heard in Compass for years. It's we'll use it on the complicated ones. I go, that's the whole point of why I made this, is so that you don't make a mistake on the routine. Most of the mistakes I find are around HRAD, the higher rate for additional dwellings. Most of the mistakes I see are around timing of the sale of your primary residence. Most of the mistakes are on, I've got that timeshare over here and I own £200,000 worth of it. You see, and I had one the other week with the first time where I literally arguing with my staff over the phone because they inherited the property from their father when he passed away when he was 16, but he sold it then. He's not owned anything for 20 years. He's a first time buyer. No, wrong. Like, it's just not the way it works. So literally, I take the absolute opposite. The routine is where the problems lie. And this is why I say I'm an advocate for the taxpayer more than the conveyancer. Sorry for this podcast, because it's the people, the husband and wife, that, yeah, the tax might swing by £1,000. For them, that's a lot of money. But to those of us, or, the usual people that go out for tax advice, it's nothing. But those people and their £1,000, they don't deserve to lose that to the government just as much as someone about to lose £1 million. It doesn't matter. The law should apply equally. And you have to, therefore, apply the same strict process to everyone, regardless. You can't just make the determination at the outset.
We'd be on that line.
This feels like another one of those. I was going to say, let's use the example of climate change as the straw that kind of broke the camel's back with conveyances. But this feels like another one of those. It's another thing that lands on the conveyancer's desk. We have to be experts now in tax advice. Otherwise, we're going to come unstuck, Ian.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I look at this from a political angle and say the government, and it's sort of mirroring what Ryan's saying, is all for the consumer, all for the client that's using legal services, and what can they do to improve and assist their position. And therefore, perhaps this idea of registration, this idea of making SDLT at the forefront of conveyancers thinking in the current environment, perhaps that's a good thing. And perhaps, again, as Ryan was saying, it's going to mean people will be saving on SDLT liability, and people will be more willing to look to try and make sure that the client's position is protected. Perhaps it's all of that. The thing that amazes me is that the professional bodies, who should have been all over this in one of two ways, either saying to firms, you need loads of training on SDLT because this is coming down the track at you, or to say to government, look, we're not ready for this, we need clarity. If we are going to be tax advisors, if you are asking us to up our game with regard to SDLT, we need time to do it. David, I'm reminded, I'm going to go back and talk about common hold, right? Common hold in 2002 was thrown at us, and we were given sort of 1.5 years, 2 years to get used to it. And therefore it was thrown at us, but it wasn't sort of an impending sort of nightmare scenario. The lawyers, conveyancers, need time to adapt and to change. And government, professional bodies and everyone else should be helping conveyancers, rather than saying, there you are, as of May, you've got to register as a tax advisor, with all the potential problems that arises. Because I go back to the preliminary point that I made. If in my retainer I'm saying I'm going to be giving you general advice with regard to SDLT, but not specialist advice, as Ryan was saying, what on earth does that mean? Okay. But if I'm now registered as a tax advisor, and I've told you I'm registered as a tax advisor, from a client's perspective, that's even more confusing. So I'm a great believer in two things: clarity, and I'm a great believer in, if we're going to change things, giving people time to change and adapt. Like David, you and I have spoken about the revised TA6. And, saying as of January, this is being launched in March. Oh, well, we've got 2 or 3 months to get our act together. I can tell you loads of firms now, even though we're beyond the deadline for the use of the revised TA6, still haven't got a clue about what it is or what it does. I get what the government is saying. I'm supportive of what Ryan is saying with regard to the fact that conveyancers are required to give advice, and the line as to where that advice ends, as it were, is blurred to oblivion. We've got that problem. We've got, what it means. I fail to see how what difference does it make if I'm registered as a tax advisor or I don't register? What's the difference other than the perception that the client will have?
They're being quite subtle with it though, but they're making the conveyancers adhere to higher standards that they didn't have to before. I mean, before we had the CQS wording on SDLT, right, which was quite vague, but it was basically keep an audit trail and a history. I think the wording was a history and the decisions taken upon reaching the calculation kind of thing, which is, again, vague, but it kind of helped. You then have, as you say, the problem of training. I mean, I know of certain training providers, but how do you keep everyone up to date? But the bit that worries me is that HMRC's own rules on this.
Yeah,
Bear in
yeah,
mind that they're putting fines in, so you're going to be fined if you get this stuff wrong. And there's the whole
yeah,
process for suspension, which again, it's like £5,000 the first 5 fines or something like that, and it's 10,000. But the point is they're saying you now must maintain correct and up-to-date knowledge of the areas of tax that they deal with, work to prevent errors in the client's tax calculations or claims, and avoid including figures in returns or claims which are unsubstantiated or speculative. Keep contemporary. It's endless.
yeah.
So
And Ryan, you've got HMRC telling you things, and then you've got decisions of the courts and tribunals that are saying that's not right.
well, exactly.
And you've got the online calculator that, I look at that and think, well, it's wrong to call it an online calculator. It's a sort of put a finger in the air and saying HMRC saying that's what we think it could be.
Well, they said that themselves when
Yeah.
someone tried to say, "Hey, up, you published this calculation." They went, "Oh no, you can't rely on that. That's just an estimate." So, all right, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks, HMRC.
But to the rank and file conveyancer, they'll use that, and you've got to say you have some sympathy that they use it, because why have it?
Yeah, that's why. I mean, I'm putting my conveyancer sympathy hat on, which I do. It's absolutely insane. It just is insane.
In and amongst the discussion there, you mentioned about the fact that there are fines and subsequent suspensions for non-compliance with tax advice. I mean, presumably that would mean that you wouldn't be able to submit your SDLT, which in effect would, it would pause the transaction, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it caused massive disruption, and again, as far as I can tell, the penalty is £5,000 for any contravention. You get the notice. They haven't been quite clear on exactly how this would work, whether it's immediate. There was some news that HMRC said, "Oh, we'll work with the contravening party to make sure it's resolved." So they're trying to kind of say there's not going to be an immediate suspension. The worrying part is that if there are any contraventions while they're suspended, then they can be banned from re-registering for a year.
Yeah.
That's death to any business if
Yeah.
you have to do any of these parts.
And that's re-registration of the business or of the individual?
I think it's the individual, but the problem is, again, if you only have these are the things we need clarity on, and I'm not quite sure on that, to be honest. But the bit that really worries me is there's an automatic rule under the registration that says you must notify all clients of your contravention.
The point there, Ryan, is if you're acting for the Nationwide Building Society, that's you off a panel, isn't it?
Yeah.
The guidance so far seems to suggest that registration will be required by a relevant individual. The rules are not aimed at middle managers, and rather are aimed at those who are responsible and have authority within a firm. So perhaps more aligned with what you were suggesting there, Ian, about money laundering reporting officers, colps, coffers, those sorts of roles. Ryan, we also glossed over, you talked about disclaimers and the fact that we can do away with some of these responsibilities through some of our client care documentation. I mean, what in your view is the implication of registration for firms, and how are they going to have to react in terms of some of their client comms to ensure that they are either telling them that we are not going to give this advice, tell them that we're going to give limited advice, or we're going to outsource this advice?
I think the ultimate endpoint is actually going to be a positive, but it's going to be one of those sort of grow through pain moments for the industry where, as you say, every conveyancing firm is going to need to sort of look introspectively and go, okay, how are we handling SDLT, and make sort of one of 2 or 3 decisions. They are either going to need to overhaul their internal processes to ensure there's nothing's missed, like I said, but do it internally, get a tax expert in that everything flows up to, maybe some process for screening that actually functions. And I mean, seriously, be careful with this, but that might be a route. Again, it's a positive because at the end of the day, it means that we are leveling up the quality of tax advice within the industry. If HMRC are ultimately nearly mandating that the industry gives tax advice, let's do it properly, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Option 2, like I say, even with the payment point, just focusing on the quality tax advice, using a service like mine, again, shameless self-plug, but yeah, outsourcing it to someone that has a competent outsourcing process, cool. The real worry I have on this is I did a bit of headcanon math on this, trying to figure out, outside of my business, if you put every single competent tax advisor in the country currently in the same sweatshop and said, go, do calculations, how many could you get through in a month? And I think it's less than 10,000, genuinely. There's an industry of, 80 to 100,000 a month. So there's a deficit even in competency in this country for ensuring that everything is calculated properly. And that's a problem we need to solve as well. But yeah, ultimately, I do hope, because I'm the eternal optimist, that, we're being forced to do it, that we just level up the quality of SDLT service to purchasers.
And to that point, Ryan, the capacity is clearly an issue. But Ian, as Ian said before, HMRC's rules are so varied and interchangeable at times that it's almost like the adage of put 10 lawyers in the room and ask them the same question, you get 10 different answers. Is it the same case that we're going to put 10 tax advisors in a room and we're going to get 10 different SDLT calculations?
No. Hopefully. The real answer to that is yes, but it's not because of interpretation, and there is interpretation, but you want to always follow the courts and HMRC. So you're talking the top slice stuff at that point. In terms of the general everyday calculations, they can be a bit nuanced, they can be a bit complex. Leases, for example, are a minefield, but again, generally with enough time and actually working out, you will all come to the same answer. Again, the problem is having people that have that time, for one, and the competency to do that regularly without fail, not fall ill, not go on holiday, and actually push things through on time, ensuring as well then that the SDLT ones are drafted correctly in relation to the calculation you've just done. Big problem.
And Ian, looking at it from the conveyancer's point of view, and you and I have talked about the client care documentation in previous podcasts, this seems like a bit of a minefield, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah, in what do you say in the retainer to your client? What do you say in your report on title to the client? I don't know. I'm protective of the conveyancer, so we've got to be as sort of as clear as we can, so that we limit our liability. But again, as far as that is concerned, what would a reasonable conveyancer be required to do with regard to SDLT? Actually, just as we speak, I'll have a look at the Solicitor's Conveyancing Handbook, the latest edition, Acting for the Buyer, A14. So this is hot off the press, okay? Right, well, first of all, the purchaser is responsible for the payment and submission of the self-assessment land transaction return. Okay, purchaser, the person acquiring the subject matter of the transaction, normally the buyer. Okay, as far as the role of the conveyancer is concerned, the conveyancer must give advice with regard to reliefs and surcharges, must ensure that the client submits the return as required by legislation, and that the SDLT return is properly completed. The problem is, right, you can't exclude liability for errors that are made with regard to calculating SDLT. Okay, so I can't, as a solicitor or conveyancer, say as part of the conveyancing process, I am not giving you any advice and not giving you any information with regard to your SDLT liability. I can't do that, right? In addition to that, I'm acting for a lender, and as far as a lender is concerned, I've got to be able to ensure that the transfer to my client and the mortgage deed on behalf of the lender are registered at the land registry, and I can't carry out that registration process without having first submitted a return and paid the appropriate SDLT. So I have an issue with regard to both the lay client, my buyer client, and also my lender. This is, again, what the Law Society Conveyancing Handbook says. Right. Does the solicitor or conveyancer necessarily know enough about the buyer's affairs to be able to conduct correspondence with HMRC for SDLT purposes? Has the client made the necessary disclosures, and have those disclosures been full and frank? where the solicitor acts only for the lender, not for the buyer, decision must be made concerning the administration of submitting the return. There's all manner of issues with regard to this that's pretty scary stuff, to be honest with you, you know?
There's something you said there as well about the buyer's affairs or knowing enough about it.
Yeah.
So this is not to get back on my soapbox, but this is a drum I like to bang a lot, where paper forms to screen risk and not actually having a conversation with the client, or knowing you need to have a conversation, and when you have that conversation, what questions are you actually going to ask? Can you then reasonably say you actually looked into their affairs?
Yeah. Well, the point there, Ryan, is it depends on the quality. You're right. The safest thing to do is sit down with the client. But the other point is your questionnaire then becomes such a bulky document. And, how do you know that the client is taking the questions seriously and providing you with the information?
Yeah.
The other point I have, and again, David, is an interesting one. Are we being paid enough to do the conveyancing work? Never mind the additional work that's required with regard to SDLT. And, can I charge a client 400 quid for giving a client SDLT advice? Should I be charging the client 400 quid on top of my conveyancing fee for this? The answer is no, unless it's complex. And again, that begs the question, what is complex? I'm supposed to do this work with the SDLT as part and parcel of the conveyancing service.
See, that's where I would advocate strongly, Ian, that it's probably the most important fundamental change we could actually ask the industry to make right now, is you're not charging for complexity. You shouldn't be, and you should be charging for doing the SDLT if you're doing it yourself, you're doing it in-house. But charge for the time it takes to properly assess the situation and to do the submission, even two separate charges if you have to, because then that is a clear representation of the work involved, right? You're not charging because it got complex eventually. You're charging to, regardless, make sure you've looked into the affairs in full.
Yeah. Fair comment.
We were always going to struggle to do stamp duty and registration, tax advisor registration justice in the course of a 25 to 30 minute podcast. We've given it a really good go. Before we move to a close, I mean, look, there is clearly an opportunity for firms to outsource some of this tax advice, but every understanding that I have around this is rather like AML. They're never going to be able to outsource their liability for this. It is still going to be, on the shoulders of the conveyancer, isn't it, Ryan?
Yeah.
No, actually.
Oh, that's one.
We use the word liability rather than registration responsibility. The fundamental difference is that you cannot outsource the responsibility for registration if, as it stands, the payment does count as communication. You can outsource your liability because ultimately, liability in terms of calculation, especially with the way that we deal with things, there is no decision that the conveyancer has made as to whether to outsource that client or not. They haven't screened them at the outset and said, oh, you look low risk, so you don't need to go through to these guys. The process we use is they come through no matter what's going on, no matter even if it looks like there's a non-returnable transaction. We make that decision for them. So in terms of liability, I like to think of it as, have I made decisions? If they've made no decisions, there's no liability. So yeah, really, and especially with the returns, we do everything end to end. There, you can outsource SDLT liability entirely.
Yeah, Ryan. So what you're saying is, if I choose Compass and I put everything through, you're right. In that situation, I'm absolved of liability. But if I'm selecting them and saying that's one for Ryan, that's one that I can deal with myself, then I say there is the potential for liability as far as the firm's concerned.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're on the same hymn sheet on that one. Yeah, great.
We've actually seen this, by the way, just anecdotally. One of our concierge firms who do put everything through, a junior member of staff looked at something and went, well, there's no SDLT return on this, so I don't need to put it through Compass. They got a fine. The only matter that they didn't put through our system in 18 months, and they got a fine because they made a decision.
We're moving to a close on the discussion now, and I guess really it's just on you guys, whether there's any sort of final points that you wanted to make about what the implications for conveyancers may very well be.
All I would say is I'd love to be in a position to give practitioners a definitive answer, and I can't.
Echo that. I really wish that no matter which way it lands, we could actually get some real answers from the government now. And I think, again, these practitioners that are now 31 days away from a registration open date, they don't know which way they're going to have to turn. It's insane. It's an insane way to treat an entire profession. It's just absolutely irresponsible.
No arguments here. Thank you very much indeed to you both for joining the podcast. Hopefully we've shed a little bit of light on this, albeit we are waiting for further guidance. But in the meantime, my thanks to Ian and also to Ryan for joining the podcast and for sharing your insight.
Cheers, David. Good to talk to you, Ryan. Thanks, everyone.
Good to see you again, Ian. Thank you.
Take care.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Ian and to Ryan. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.